So good morning, everyone. I want to thank Laurie for having this idea of the seminars and for giving us the opportunity to imagine and spell out which could be our Latin America singularity, because we have to work on it. I'm not sure, although I'm not sure if you would like the picture that will come out of it. I also want to thank Camila, Paula, Guilherme, Luis Gustavo, and Henrique for their collaboration in outlining these ideas and gathering the necessary data for this talk. My idea is to present some quick impressions of what could be considered the most important particularities of Brazilian social formation and how they could affect the issues we are trying to capture in our project. I assembled some data of 4 critical dimensions that I feel makes some difference when non-religion is at stake. One topic is what I call Brazilian top-down state formation. The second is the fragility of Brazilian middle classes. The third is the peculiar permeability between religions and the actual political system. And the fourth is the 1908 Constitution as a threshold for diversity to pluralism. I will explore these 4 topics. So let's start with Brazilian top-down state formation. The colonial system and afterwards the Republican government built a very complex and modern law system and administrative apparatus. In the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the big issue was constructing sovereignty, a representative political system out of a mass of a miscegenated and illiterate population. Many authors agree that the legal institution of the Republican state preceded the experience of Brazilian society as an imagined national community. So we first constructed the state, and afterwards we started to produce society. This particularity unfolds 3 other features that can be framed as the central role of Christianity in the national cultural formation. 2, the centrality of the state decisions and initiatives in Brazilian social, political, and economic development. 3, the weak commitment between state regulation and ordinary life. So let's take a fast overview of these 3 issues: Christianity and nationality. In this scenario, the Catholic Church has a considerable role in the constructions of Brazilian nationality. It had an enormous influence on building up an homogeneous cultural nation through the idea of religious and racial syncretism. But at the same time, most of the secularization process, that is, the restriction of the Catholic power over the state organization, its public policies, has been historically conducted by the state political forces and mostly inspired by the existing scientific knowledge. Paradoxically, the state administration, freed from the church apparatus since the beginning of the 20th century, started developing a secular public policy on health and education directed towards the low-income families, women, and Black population. The Catholic Church quickly understood that its hegemony depended on its alliance with non-religious political force. Close collaboration between Catholic and non-Catholic intellectuals worked to associate religious tradition to a national civic imaginary. The idea of a great Catholic nation was a recurring narrative during the 20th century, which persisted convincingly until the 70s. Catholic schools assumed responsibility for performing Catholicism associated with progress and science, developing laboratories, technological and scientific equipments, and training their students in Swedish gymnastics and civic festivals in, of course, religious schools. What about the centrality of the state? The state's historical role in Brazilian society's constructions and its economic development turn political populism an easy path. Brazilian people see the state as both, as a threat and as a guarantee. The common thought is to blame the state for all our mistakes and to expect from the state all solutions. The state is not clearly perceived as the embodiment of the common good and the collective will. In ordinary life, public patrimony is seen as a no man's land. This is one of the reasons that explains the instability of the boundaries between the legal and illegal activities in Brazil. The intermittent nature of government control, the illegibility of the law, and the negotiations around the thin lines between legal and illegal are part of the everyday life of Brazilian poor and not so poor neighborhoods. Bribes, occupation of state lands, stealing water or electricity is condoned in exchange for bribes, votes, or other service linked to the underlife of politics. In this scenario, it is challenging to develop an idea of common good and create the space of autonomy needed to build a robust and well-organized civil society. Social movements are very recent in Brazil. They come from the 70s, many of them born from the groundwork of the Catholic Church. During President Lula's term, most of them become part of the state agenda. Let's turn to the weakness of the middle classes. In recent years, the hypothesis that Brazil is becoming a middle class country has been repeatedly raised. Nevertheless, when you look at the income distribution, the picture we get is one of a profound economic inequality. The Brazilian population is about 211 million people. We are the 5th country in the world in terms of population size. But the household income per capita in Brazil today is low, $253 per month. The minimum wage is $185. In the official classification of 5 economic classes, the 1% considered upper class in Brazil, not including the millionaires, has an income between $2,000 and $6,000. That is the upper class. Our middle classes are situated in an income bracket that runs from $600 to $2,500. And what about the majority of the population? 60% of the population of the Brazilian people earns less than $400. The lack of a strong middle class in Brazil is part of the problem of the weakness of a Brazilian civil society we mentioned before. This is also, in fact, one of the reasons that make it very difficult to depart political and moral values from religious norms. In general terms, to this large portion of Brazilian population, religion defines their relationship networks, gives them a sense of order, and bless their gifts. religion is also a language to articulate their views on social and political life. With this picture, it is easy to understand churches and other religious organizations' importance in the population's educational, social, and emotional support. What is interesting is that people who describe themselves as non-religious also come from this same popular segment. In the case of the middle classes, its heterogeneity makes it hard to describe the religious importance in their day-to-day experience. Sociological studies about this segment point out that it comprises a large range of professions and skills such as administrators, non-manual and manual workers, small proprietors, and public workers. Numbers show that middle classes prefer spiritists and other esoteric faiths. Spiritists are in general more wealthy and educated than Catholics and evangelicals. When it comes to education, it is essential to highlight that Brazil still carries 11 million people of illiterates, in general above 50 years old. The 23% of the young population neither works or studies. That is, school is not seen by a large segment of the youth as an option for a better life. Among the middle classes, only professionals and administrators, or 20% of Brazilian youth, have a complete college education. Therefore, it seems to me that we have to keep in mind, when it comes to research about non-religion, that social classes, education, and income matters. It is important to know, in these terms, who is doing, for instance, trekking, who is organizing themselves in community gardens, which segments of the population we are talking about when it comes to research about non-religion. Let's talk about now of the political system, religions and the political system. Although evangelicals' politicization is not new, they have stood out in Brazil due to the massive use of electoral strategy in the last decades. With an excellent capacity for popular mobilization, churches can elect representatives to municipal and state legislative houses and for National Congress, where they currently occupy 12% of the seats. Pastors are likely to work in their churches as electorate gatekeepers. For Pentecostal, participation in legislative power is viewed as a way of survival in a social order in which relations between the state and religious groups have always been asymmetrical. It is also a way of building a path to recognition and influence in a political situation in which the feminist agenda has been very influential and the state public policies were promoting the expansion of secularism. In the last legislature, evangelical parliamentarians reached 90 names. They were associated with at least 13 different religious denominations and 8 different parties, only 3 of them religious. We have to keep in mind that 33 different political parties compose Brazilian parliament, 33. There are so many and so ideological blurred. The deputies arrange innovative ways to construct political alliances and coalitions. One of them is called parliamentarian fronts. In practice, those fronts functions as blocks of deputies who act coordinatorily on specific topics. They bring together parliamentaries regardless their political parties. In other words, the fronts are equivalent to a space of mobilized opinion, authorized and made official by Congress, in which actors are articulate not by ideology or political partisan criteria, but by elective affinities. Evangelical parliamentaries used to gather in what they call evangelical fronts. These deputies have alliance with Catholic colleagues who also have supra-coordinations, such as the Roman Catholic Parliamentary Front. These two legislative fronts, Catholic and evangelical, are mobilized in favor of bills that deal, for the most part, with sexual morality such as gender equality, abortion, euthanasia, and same-sex marriage. At the forefront of such projects, there are, of course, church leaders. However, we have to keep in mind that there are countless different fronts in Congress. The front to defend the Boy Scouting, in defense of women football, taxi drivers class front, Friends of Tibet front, etc. Therefore, those political alliances are very conjunctural, and because of that, they can be also very unstable and cyclical. Finally, about the 98 Constitution and as the threshold from diversity to pluralism. The process of redemocratization has marked the last 4 Brazilian decades. In this new political context, the state seeks to empower social movement to create new forms of popular participation and public affairs management. At first, the restoration of the democratic order raised a great expectation in reviewing the old country's political culture, seen as personalistic, authoritarian, and clientelistic. Significant advances have been made, especially in the field of human rights, but in the end, in my view, was no substantial transformation of this national political culture. As we know, accommodation of diversity has escorted religious liberty, legal protection in many countries, but not in Brazil. The 98 constitutions represent a significant change in how the Brazilian state deals with ethnic religious differences. Until then, the ruling model for assembling religious differences was syncretism. This ideology produced and organized religious diversity by including this diversity hierarchically within the Catholic culture and Brazilian nationality. In this sense, we can say that we had religious freedom, but we had religious freedom in detriment of religious equality. The Catholic Church moral hegemony over the nation's idea of progress implied the repression of what they call superstitions, idolatries, and mysticism. They were seen as the core of popular practices. This battle against ignorance was conducted in the name of science and at the expense of non-Catholic, communist, and Afro-Brazilian religions that were criminalized until the 60s and the 70s. Thus, although in the first Republican Constitution, the state was declared to be secular and neutral regarding religious diversity, the practices described as false religions and superstitions were not placed among the elements that deserve state protection. The concept of religious liberty appeared to be an appropriate political formula for responding to the Catholic Church aspirations, which wanted to be free from the state guidance imposed by the Padroado Real system. Moreover, this principle allowed inscribing Christian norms and values in the Republican laws. Now, religious freedom is serving the evangelical interest of seeking political and cultural hegemony. The formula of accommodation religious difference through Catholic hegemony underwent a profound transformations in the 90s. The new constitution instituted the paradigm of pluralism. Here, the emphasis goes to equity and equality. In this new configuration, diverse popular practice, although still carrying its historical difficulties to be recognized as religions, began to compete for state protection, state resources, and social influence. Contrary to the Latin America countries such as Argentina, which created official institutions to control worship, rites, sacred groups, and theologies, Brazilian civil codes understood that religious liberty would be better guaranteed if there were no state mechanisms for monitoring cults and religious ideas. This lenient legal configuration permitted a large variety of donation and ritual combination that in practice left unclear which entities deserve protection and legal immunities. Demographers project that in 2028, evangelical will be the majority of the Brazilian population. But the modus operandi of the new Pentecostals challenge the relative well-established convention of the coexistence of religious difference in the public space through the previous syncretic model of secularism. One of the results of this new understanding is the emergence of religious intolerance. It is hard to say right now whether intolerance will expand as a form of collective coexistence. It is true that Brazilian society is being increasingly polarized. However, a long-standing understanding still prevails in which inter-religious coalitions is seen as a positive path to broadening the general acceptability of religious practice in public life. There is a persistent consensus among the ruling classes that religions in general, and not only Catholicism, can represent a positive instrument for social pacification in the competitive context of a plural society. Thank you.